parallels. I've tried for 23 years in this church, if you've listened and kept any kind of notes, always foundationalize what I believe as a Christian based on the Word of God. And one of the parallels that Ezra chapter 8, beginning at verse 21 and concluding at verse 23, provides for us is a reflection upon God's protection. Anytime we give anything to God, it ought not be done casually. It ought to be deliberately, and it ought to be out of an attitude of preparation, particularly as we prepare ourselves on the goodness of God, and moreover, when that goodness is underscored by God's protection. In verse 21, you pick up where the story takes place at the Ahava Canal, a tributary of the Euphrates, out in the desert region. 5,000 people are waiting, listening to Ezra as he makes a decision in the face of crises, how we're going to get the treasure of God safely home. In verse 21, you pick up that he proclaims in the hearing of the people a fast that they will participate in. But what he is really trying to advocate is that they would humble themselves to God, that they would pray to God, submit to God's safety, and that God would give them safe passage from where they are to Jerusalem. That's the whole emphasis. That's the setting of the story. But beyond that, in the very next verse, in verse 22, Ezra is confronted with a crisis decision. He has to get this enormous treasure back to Jerusalem. He can appeal to Artaxerxes, the pagan king, to accompany him with a dispatched cavalry. But notice in the same verse why he doesn't ask for this Persian king, this pagan king, to assist him. It's because he's already concluded that the hand of the Lord was upon them, and it was on everyone that looked in God's direction. And so if Ezra asked Artaxerxes to accompany me, and once they made it to Jerusalem, you would have to give adulation not just to God, but to Artaxerxes also. And so as we prepare to give our greatest gift that we can to God, it begins with a renunciation of dependence upon anything else. And I don't know any word that's more apropos today than that statement, a renunciation upon any dependence other than God. We have just come through a horrible season in the life of this country in finances, and many Christians started sounding just like non-Christians, wondering where they were going to get resources and how they were going to make it. Isn't it amazing how even Christians, especially us in the middle of a crisis, began to talk as if it was our education and our finances that has sustained us in the first place. We forgot that it was God who had been keeping us. It is God who had fed us, God who had clothed us, God that had put shoes on our feet, God that put food on our table, God that kept a shelter over our head, God that kept gas in our car, God that kept the lights on, God that was paying the mortgage, not your education and not the resources that you have made. It's God's protection. And these are not just statements for us to use as high points of preaching to arouse the congregation. This is foundational to who we are, that one of the attributes that we connect to in the faithfulness of God is that God protects us. And as a result, verse number 23, the fast is implemented. Renunciations of anything to satisfy them are denied them, and now they depend solely upon the protection of God. God does protect us, and God has protected you. Many times we have to be reminded of how God has protected us. And I was thinking in preparation of this message, kind of racking my brain through last week. How do we really think about how God protects us? Because often you'll come to a church like this, and depending on how it sounds, a phrase, we'll get more caught up in the sound than the real substance of what it means for God's protection. I want to use some cold, hard, unemotional statistics that will help us, hopefully, not just today, but every time we get ready to complain about something not being done in our favor, or because things look like they're put on delay, that we'll be very careful never to forget that it is God's protection that has kept us. Just last year, 619,097 people died of heart diseases. And there's some people in our congregation I know personally who suffer with heart diseases. And I've said to them, as I'll say to you, the fact that you are here today is that God has protected you. 44,000 people died in related accidents. That's some number like 30 out of every 100,000 people. And some of you have been in accidents and you didn't die. It's because God has protected you. 30,000 people last year were murdered. That's 9 out of every 100,000 people. And some of you have been close to that point, possibly somebody with a pistol in your face, a knife at your throat. And the fact that you're sitting here this morning is evident that God has protected you. 1 out of 11 million people would die in a plane crash or related to some kind of air traffic accident. That means for 29,000 years, you can fly every day for 29,000 years without the possibility, with one chance, 1%, that you might have an air accident. And I fly all the time, and I've been in turbulence and storm, and there have been times where I thought my number was called up. But the fact that I'm here this morning is evident that God protects. If you drive a car every single day in a city like this, nationwide, the numbers narrow down. 1 out of 5,000 people will be killed in an automobile accident. You don't even have to look at the national statistics. Just look at living in Houston, Texas. And if you make it home today, it's a miracle of God because God protects us. And let me say something to you. Don't let people have to convince you of God's protection. Don't ever get to a place where you assume that you played the right card, had the right hand, down the right bone. No, the only reason why that we are here right now is because of the faithfulness of God's protection. Some of us saw that last week in an East apartment in Paris, France. A 15-month-old baby playing with its 3-year-old sibling out on the 7-story building of their apartment house, rolled off, just crawled off the 7 stories and was falling. As the baby was moving to the edge of the 7-story apartment building, downstairs across the street in a brasserie, a 4-year-old boy was looking out the window, told his daddy a baby getting ready to fall. The daddy didn't even look, just got up, ran out the door, ran across the street. The baby was falling. Of all the days, the man kept the canopy out. Normally, he would pull it in because when people up on the 6th and 7th and 5th and 4th floor, they would throw their cigarettes out, it would burn the canopy. But that day, he just left it out. And the baby hit the canopy and bounced up. It gave the man enough time to open his arm and the baby to fall in his arms. You tell me that God won't provide for you and God won't protect you. And there are those of us who are here this morning, our stories may not be as poetic, they may not be as dramatic, but I'll tell you what, and that's why you ought to pick up some of your old literature, some of your old spirituals, and some of your old hymns, and you ought to read some great literature and poetry sometime, because they'll tell you that when I laid down last night, God didn't let my bed become my cooling board or my sheets, my winding sheet. That is, God watched over me all night long and God protected me. And the fact that you're here right now is evidence that God has protected you. Preach, Pastor. But since God protects and provides for us, then why don't we joyfully present to God that which has been protected? Think about it. Why would you not do it? I watch the way some of you give. I don't like your attitudes. You don't give with no real, you give like this. Hey, if God gave you health and God gave you strength and let you work to make money, and you put it in that in that envelope, you ought to put that thing in there with dignity and with pride and thanksgiving. And when you give, you ought to. Any of y'all play cards, spades, anything, a bid or anything? Well, you know, in spades, if you got a major hand, they say you're getting ready to run a Boston. And have you ever had the fortunate, the right partner? You didn't have the best hand, but you knew we just two plays, just 2 books. We just 2 downs from running a Boston, but we got to play in sync. And that Boston comes. A Boston is when you just take every book. I mean, nothing go wrong. Or when you got the hand, you're like, oh, this is it. You got 4 aces and 4 kings. And then you got the rest all in trump. And you just sit there and say, this is the hand. I mean, this is it. And you say 13. And this is how it goes. You just, first it's like, bam. And then, bam. And you say, bring it back here. Bow. And then you say, do I need to keep on going on? And then you just say, bam, 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 bam. Well, when the Lord has protected you and given you a Boston, you ought to show up in church if it ain't but $20 in that thing to say, this all I got, but I'm giving it to God because the Lord protected my treasure. Hey. And I really mean that. You ought to get happy about that. If you know that that's all you can give, then you ought to give it and watch God roll back the heavens and bless you and say, I like the way you did that. Because I believe God looks as much at the attitude as the amount of what we give. If the Lord has blessed you, even today, you ought to give that thing with some pride and excitement and say, Lord, thank you that you blessed me to be able to give something. Yeah. You ought to thank him today and ask him, Lord, help me get my